Ahoy there! Call me Crabby, and today I'll be delivering a talk titled Mind the Gap, where I'll be helping you gain a better understanding of what your security control framework might not cover for your organization. Let's get started. At times, security is akin to sailing. In both cases, you are assisting with steering an entity towards its intended destination safely, whether it be an organization or a ship. In the case of sailing, you may be on the lookout for dangerous conditions that could affect the journey. Things like stormy weather, hidden rocks, and of course, kraken attacks. For you see, security is akin to sailing when sea monsters are thrown into the mix. And for the ill-fitted ship that doesn't have the capability to spot these dangers or proper defenses to fight back, or even the escape plan, if things go south, they may find that their journey will come to an abrupt end. So how is this similar to securing an organization? Well, for an organization that does not have the proper procedures in place, they too may find themselves not able to defend against attackers if they are sought out as a target of opportunity. And the attack vectors are several, from things like insider threats to software vulnerabilities to phishing attacks. And similar to how a ship, it may be doomed if it suffers a major breach in its hull, an organization may be doomed after suffering one or several data breaches. So what is an organization supposed to do to stay afloat and try to navigate these treacherous waters? Well, one thing they can do is be strategic in the security that they implement within your organization. This is where control frameworks come into the picture. Simply put, they are a collection of recommended actions that aim to reduce the frequency and impact of harmful events. And one example of a control would be something like establish and maintain detailed enterprise asset inventory. By doing so, an organization will gain a better sense of what devices do they own and what they can do to limit the amount of exposure they have. And oftentimes, organizations are driven by necessity to adopt a framework, simply because it might be something due to legal, contractual, or regulatory obligations. Let us broadly categorize the types of control frameworks out there that might be of interest to the security industry. There are frameworks that are used at a federal level. These would be documents that are maintained and distributed by government, and for organizations that are looking to work with certain sectors within the government, they may be finding themselves having to meet these frameworks requirements in order to continue their operations. So one example would be Cyber Essentials over in the UK. Another example of a control framework that has a federal basis will be the CMMC over in the States, which is short for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. That one is more relevant for contractors who seek to work with the Department of Defense. Another broad category here would be industry-based control frameworks. This would be documents that are meant to, with a keen focus on a certain industry such as finance or healthcare. Here's one example being the PCI DSS, which is short for the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. That one is focused on how credit card information is handled within an organization and processed. Another example of an industry-based framework would be the High Trust CSF, which is short for the Health Information Trust Alliance Common Security Framework, and is meant for organizations that deals with healthcare data. Another category would be frameworks that have a contractual obligation. These are frameworks that might not necessarily apply at a federal or industry level, but they're simply frameworks that an organization can adopt and get certified with to show that they have meet a certain baseline and to give a form of assurance to other companies that are looking to work with them and entrust them with their data. So this would be two examples would be the ISO 27701 framework, which is a document that is maintained by International Organization for Standardization that has a collection of information security management standards. Another example would be the SOC 2, which is short for System Organization Controls 2. And then we come to the fourth broad category of control frameworks, which is those that have community basis. These would be frameworks that are kind of driven by community effort and give a collection of recommended actions that may not be adequately addressed in the other three categories. So two examples here would be the sys controls, which is more oriented towards technical recommendations. It might be of interest to IT folks overall. And then we have the CCMM, which is short for the Cloud Controls Matrix and is maintained by a Cloud Security Alliance. And if you already took a guess, you can probably recognize that this framework is more oriented towards cloud security. And so while we would hope that an organization would be proactive in trying to implement and adopt the framework to help secure the organization, and in certain cases they may be driven by the fact that they realize, oh gosh, we have an incident, we have to do something about it, and then they kind of choose and adopt the framework to help them gain a better sense of security and regain control of things. All right. And this is where I want to discuss how control frameworks are kind of like maps, if they were maps from like the 17th or 18th century. The key thing to keep in mind is that since every framework is different and has different objectives, they all kind of have a sense of what an organization do to be secure, but they also are each different in their own ways, different enough that they might not cover everything that an organization needs to know. And the reason why is because each organization is different and have unique security risks that they care about that a framework might not be able to meet. Keep in mind, security control frameworks are not quite one size fits all. So, and also and a few other things, how a control framework is like a map from 17th, 18th century. It won't help decide for you where to go. That is simply something that the organization has to decide for themselves. It won't tell you how risky your journey will be or how much is the acceptable amount of risk for the organization. Those are questions that has to be answered in conversation between the security department along with board members in the organization and those who are at a C-suite level. And of course, these maps won't have all the information that an organization will need. There will be gaps. And so how can we go about identifying these gaps? Well, here are three broad recommendations. One is, first, help an organization catalog the security risks that are relevant. Second would be to help the organization review and monitor what controls are implemented and how they're implemented to see if they are implemented correctly or if there's something that has to be fixed. And lastly, you should try to understand the relationship and dependencies between your controls, because for an organization that does not adequately recognize the security risks that they care about, or that is not checking the controls for incorrect implementation, or that perhaps doesn't have a good keen understanding of how these controls relate, they may find themselves having gaps within a security program overall. Okay, let's try to address the first recommendation, security risks. So, just to be clear, since risk is one of those words that are kind of used in security industry in a lot of scenarios, it's kind of best to try to define what I mean by it first, because otherwise we get sentences like that is a high level of risk for that risk, where it kind of becomes confusing what is meant by risk in the first place. So when I say risk, I'm not referring to it as a probability. I'm simply referring to risk as an uncertain event that can affect an organization's ability to achieve their objectives. So this would be something like a data breach, or something like maybe the destruction of data on a asset or ransomware. What are the events that the organization is concerned about? And keep in mind that every organization runs on a certain level of risk, because that is they're taking opportunity to invest time and resources to achieve something that is uncertain. So for every organization, they have a different appetite when it comes to risk, about how much uncertainty they're willing to accept. And of course, when it comes to risk, there are 4 primary ways to deal with it. You can either accept the risk, you can try to remove the risk, you can try to mitigate the risk, or you can try to transfer it. In a case of mitigate, it would be something like perhaps you implement a policy for encrypting data at rest. So in the case that if data was stolen, it is harder for an attacker to access simply because it is encrypted data. In the case of transfer, most of the time that would be related to security insurance, just things that help transfer risk off to a third party. Okay, now let's talk about identifying security risks. In this industry, you will hear about a model known as the CIA Triad, which deals with confidentiality, integrity, availability of certain assets. But one key thing here that might be missing from the conversation, that might drive better discussions about security risk, is first talking about the value. Thinking about what is valuable to an organization and how do we create that value in the first place. And so by bringing in the idea of value and the process used for value, we can start thinking about more directly what are the bad events that could happen to these assets, and start thinking a little bit more clearly about security risk. So things about like, how can data be destroyed? How can people be denied access to facilities? Things like, how can certain technology, if not properly handled, become unusable over time? Things like this that helps the organization clearly understand what security risks they might be concerned about. Okay, so let's try applying this kind of way of thinking towards risk when we're trying to select controls. Here in the box is an example list from ISO 27002, the most recent one actually from this year. And for these 8 controls under people categories, if you were to go and simply try to implement them without thinking about the risk, you may not be as effective as you were if you had the risk in mind that the organization cares about, and then you can tailor these controls to best suit and address these types of risks. So let's say if we thought about the risk of when it comes to dealing with people, perhaps maybe the company is concerned about limiting the amount of workplace violence, trying to prevent coworkers from harming another employee. Or perhaps they are concerned about insider threats how to detect whether somebody's trying to steal proprietary information and perhaps sell it to a competitor. So by having the risk first in mind, that helps you better understand what the controls might be helping to achieve. So next, let's talk about proper control implementation. What does it look like? Well, for one, policy. Because without policy, certain controls might not be implemented at all. Policy helps the organization understand what exactly is it trying to achieve and try, set a certain baseline of an appropriate level of security for them. An ideal policy should, address what type of risk is this for, the assets that this control and policy applies to, the owner, as in who is accountable for the implementation of this control, and then, of course, the custodian, which is simply referring to who is responsible for monitoring and maintaining this control. And then when it comes to documenting what is done, it is important to record it because for people who are new and brought onto the organization can recognize what has been the process and keep building upon that process. And it's also important for simply in case of if you recognize something goes wrong, you can go back to documentation and update it. So ideally, control documentation should have an objective statement, simply that quickly summarizes what the control is or what it will achieve, and then maybe a few notes about dependencies. Does this control depend or it works in tandem with another control? And this will become a little bit important later on, where we talk about an ontology that can be used to categorize frameworks or categorize controls within frameworks. Let's start talking about that ontology. So there's a group called the FAIR Institute that has a certain ontology that helps with categorizing broadly how controls are. And there's 3 main levels at a high overview of where controls fall into. This would be controls at an asset level, controls at variance level, and controls at a decision-making level. For asset level, that's simply something as simple as like applying a firewall to an asset. These are the controls that can be applied directly to an asset. For something like variance level controls, that would be the 2 key ones there would be policy and security awareness training. Controls that help the organization limit too much deviation from an appropriate level of security for them. And then when it comes to the decision-making level, this is more about making sure that the company is able to make informed decisions about security risk management and do it repeatedly. Okay, so when it comes to asset level, there are 2 broad categories for this. You have controls that prevent loss events, and you have controls that detect and respond to loss events. So an example of trying to prevent a loss event would be something if you had like a web application firewall, WAF for short, that tries to monitor for malicious traffic that comes to a web server and drop those type of traffic. But then what happens if something gets passed? Well, ideally you want controls that help you detect and respond to if let's say someone was able to try to trigger an vulnerability within one of your web servers. So it's key here to know that you have a combination of those control categories. If you don't have a control that helps prevent a loss event and only detect and respond, you might be overloading your security department with work since without that preventive control. And on the flip side, if you have controls that prevent but don't have adequate controls to detect and respond to loss events, then you are simply relying on the hope that nothing gets past that first control. Now let's talk about controls at a variance level. This also is broadly defined into two categories: controls that prevent too much deviation in security levels, and controls that detect and respond to conditions that permit significant deviation. And prevention, we already discussed about this. Policy and security awareness training are key here, making sure that people understand what is expected and making sure that they understand how it can be done. And then when it comes to detection and response, this can be done in a couple of forms, such as something like audits, or it can be done sometimes with something like having well-informed people who can detect when the conditions around the organization has changed and requires, changing the appropriate level of security. And sometimes it can be not just conditions inside the organization, but sometimes affected by conditions outside. Like, for, let's say, an example of Log4j, that was an event that many organizations realize, okay, we are likely have deviated from our appropriate level of security because now we recognize that there is this vulnerability that probably affects us within an organization, and we have to do our best to regain a sense of control and address that. And finally, you have controls at decision-making level. So this would be things, and here the three components are key. You need to make sure that the appropriate people are enabled to make informed decisions based on repeatable processes and reliable information. You need to make sure that you have the ability to detect when poorly made decisions regarding security risks are made. And that this could be simply meaning that you have people informed on who to notify and who to get involved if these cases occur. And most importantly, you have to have an organization that's willing to learn from these mistakes and respond to them and document lessons learned, so to prevent these kind of mistakes from happening again in the future. Okay, in short, your control framework will not cover everything your organization needs. There may be gaps in your security program as a result. And to help you find those gaps, it helps by trying first understand the risks that the organization cares about, continuously checking and verifying controls, and lastly, recognizing how your controls relate and affect each other. If you want examples of controls that perhaps might not be included in one or several frameworks you have, I would recommend checking out these free resources that are mainly compendiums and controls from several frameworks. By doing so, you can probably get a better coverage of what your organization might not be addressing already. That's all I have for today. I hope you have a wonderful time with the rest of Digital Overdose, and I hope you all have smooth sailing in your security careers to come. Thank you very much.